This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. An old friend of mine who I really enjoy talking to has joined me today. Harsh Gupta has many hats. He's, of course, a fund manager and somebody who really understands something I don't understand very well, the markets, and works very deeply on that. But Harsh has also been part of government committees. He wrote this wonderful book with another friend of ours called The Idea of a New India. And it had some excellent ideas, and it was promoted by the Prime Minister of India. So Harsh, over the years that I've known him for about, I would say about 12 years or so, has done many things. But I think if you zoom out and look at Harsh's work, he really tries to, especially now, I think in the last 2, 3 years, tries to give us a perspective of what an alternative way of looking at Indian economics and the Indian economy could be from a clearly Indian vantage point. This does not mean that he's trying to, cut away India and make it this isolationist world, but he's trying to understand things and tell us about how it works to India's advantage from an Indian point of view. Harsh, welcome.
Thank you, Hindol. It's always an honor to talk to you. And I'll say on the record what I said off the record, that I am such a huge fan of your books and how prolific you are. And that it's just I need to actually pick your brains on how you go about your writing schedule and discipline, because it's amazing. It's genuinely
You're too
amazing.
kind, Harsh. We all learn from one another. Let me then go straight into the conversation, Harsh, and I've been wanting to talk to you about this. Let me begin with almost a sort of baseline question. A lot of people, and since you work with the market so intensely every day, a lot of people are wondering how the markets, in a sense, have absorbed this entire tariff chaos. Let's begin from there. 20, when they were anticipating 15%, then 25%, now maybe 50%, and yet the markets isn't going into a free fall that some people expected. Somewhere it's being absorbed and sort of recalibrated in the markets. How's this working, do you think? And what are the readings of the Indian markets at the moment, considering what Donald Trump is doing?
Hindol, an excellent question for us to begin with. See, markets or market prices or market valuations, or the headline numbers, the indices that we see, there are two broad components to it, right? One is the profits those underlying companies are making, which in turn link to the revenue and the margins. And the second part is the multiples those companies get, right? If you're making an X amount of profit, are you trading at 15x, 20x, and so on and so forth? So that's the valuation part, and the first is the profit part. Both of these have, of course, an American angle or connection to it, because, and I'll come to the numbers, there is an amount that we directly export to the US. We'll discuss it in detail. And the second part is, of course, not on the trade side, but on the finance side, the investment flows, foreign institutional investors who often are directly or indirectly disproportionately American. I mean, I say indirectly because they may come through other jurisdictions, but effectively it is American capital. And to what extent does that impact? So we can break down the impact of what you asked of Trump's current trade war against India and the impact on Indian markets to two components. One is the actual component on revenue and profits, and one is the sentiment, multiple financial flows, valuation impact of it. On the first part, the numbers are very easy to understand. India's good exports, remember Donald Trump, because in it works from an American interest point of view, he has exempt all services because America is relatively more dominant in services. So his entire trade war globally has focused on goods. And remember, to give the quote unquote, the metaphorical devil his nuanced due, Donald Trump, I believe, was born in 1946. So it's not even necessarily all very calculated. If you grew up in the 1960s and 70s, you probably saw manufacturing as key to national strength, which of course it still is, that there have been developments in a post-industrial sense as well. So his war has focused on goods. India exports about, I think, $90 billion of goods to the US. It imports around $40-50 billion of goods from the US. So its goods surplus to the US is around $40-50 billion. We separately have services trade with them. So our gross goods trade is $130-140 billion. If you add services in a conventional sense, it's $200 billion, and then you can add about some digital services that get rerouted through other jurisdictions. You can add the money that Indian parents or Indian young students spend on their education for higher education in the US. And we can reach about $250 billion if you add everything up, right? Tourism is already included in conventional services, education is generally not. Uh, but even on the goods part, $90 billion, let's say around half is exempt because pharma currently it may have a separate tariff. Right now it is exempt. Consumer electronics, etc., is exempt, of course, because Apple is building in India to diversify away from China. And Tim Cook gave this golden kind of some kind of gift to Donald J. Trump. And I think a friend of mine, Diva Jain, who writes on Twitter also, and I think she's right on this particular point, absolutely, that the right way to lobby the US is not the government. Of course, that has to happen, is through the corporations. Once they have a stake in your economy, then they start lobbying on your behalf. So basically, the amount of gross exports that is at exposure at risk is around $40 to $50 billion. I think the government estimate put the number at $48 billion. Now, even the $48 billion, let's play it out. It will not go to zero, right? You can't replace stuff overnight. So a back of the hand calculation shows an annual impact of around 50 bips of the Indian economy. The Indian economy is around $4 trillion. 50 bips is around $20 billion. So that's a fair number to work with. Of course, in FY26, we're already getting halfway through. So the impact on this FY's GDP will be slightly less. It will, if assuming it remains at 50%, in FY27, it will carry through. But once the 12-month cycle is out, there is no incremental further negative impact. It's a one-time impact, right? That's just how the base works. Even there, we just saw the Nikki Haley's kind of op-ed today in Newsweek, co-authored with somebody from Hudson Institute, talking about, let's not throw away the India relationship, etc. Now, you can say it's deep state, neocon, whatever. That's their internal discussion. There's no point for us to psychoanalyze it beyond the point. But there is a pushback within the US system on, of course, the sustainability of this 50% tariff. Secondly, of course, Donald Trump himself just met those 8 European leaders as school kids in the White House. He had met Putin earlier. And there is a serious chance, again, fairly or unfairly, of some kind of settlement to happen. If there is a US-Russia settlement on Ukraine, effectively, then, of course, there is no concept of a secondary tariff conceptually that applies, or what the White House not very advisedly use the word secondary sanctions. So that does not mean that Trump suddenly starts liking Modi or India. And the base 25%, as you rightly said in the beginning, is still higher than what we initially expected. But I highly doubt the 50% number stays. And I think that's also what the market is reading, because if the number stays at 50%, then definitely the Indo-US relationship is significantly damaged. Because if the Americans are so hell-bent on destroying what they've called dead economy, which begs the question, why do you want to destroy what's already dead? But nevertheless, if they're so hell-bent on that, then I don't see the relationship bouncing back anytime soon. If it reverts to just 25%, and the initial negotiations are at pause right now, and even if it takes a few months for the full FTA or whatever the bilateral FTA to happen, I think the relationship will find some footing, not as warm as what people have perceived, but it will find some footing. I think at 50%, there is a free fall. So I think the markets are just not expecting the base case of 50% to be there. So that's on the impact on revenue and profits, right? Remember, IT services, etc., are not part of the goods trade war. Now, what on the impact of the multiples, because there are two parts in the market. The defining feature of Indian public markets, and by extension Indian markets at large, because private investments eventually IPO and come into the public markets, is how much more dominant domestic capital has gotten for Indian public markets in the last 5 to 10 years, especially in the last 5 years. I think around the middle of the last decade, FIIs, or what we call FPIs, held around 24% of the Indian market. Right now, they're down to 16%. And that entire 8 percentage points have gone to DIIs or slightly more. So the incremental marginal buyer is not always necessarily an FII to the extent they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now, that does not mean FIIs are not important. If they come back, suddenly you have two set of buyers, because right now the DIs and FIIs have been cancelling each other. It's like that B.R. Chopra's Mahabharat, that one arrow is coming from here, one arrow is coming from there, they were canceling each other out, right? If they both go in the same direction, which is likely because of the dollar cycle and this and that, we can go to technicals later on. Then, of course, the market's multiples also receive firmer support. Maybe some promoter sales happen, some more QIPs, some more IPOs. So, long story short, the actual impact on trade is low given the numbers, and I think markets are not expecting 50% to be the base case. And the impact on the multiples, aka financial flows, inflows from FIIs directly to the US, they are important, but they're not as important as they used to be 5 or 10 years ago, given domestic capital. That is the primary reason why the markets seem relatively sanguine after these, kind of pronouncements of 25 and then 50% came through. To be fair, a month before that, they were a bit nervous. So it's also a question of, selling on the rumor, buying on the news, if you will. So the market had already anticipated that not everything is going hunky dory the way it was perceived to be, say, 2 or 3 months ago. But once the information came out, markets being markets, they always like any kind of predictability, even if it's bad news. So the markets don't expect the 50% to stay, because if that is staying, then we have many, many more serious problems beyond the market. Then we are talking about a genuine, complete geopolitical reset. So I don't think the markets expect that to happen. They just expect a chill. Although we are happy to increase the contradiction, so to speak, in a Hegelian sense on social media. Indians are pushing back with national pride, and they should. But at the government to government level, I think things will probably settle down.
So I want to ask you, before we go deeper into trying to understand the impact of these tariffs, I also want to talk to you a little bit about something that you alluded to. There are a lot of concerns that come up on this, tapering away of basically of foreign direct investment in India. Now, some of us worked for many years on this issue, and as I see it, there are two or three broad principles. I mean, we are also perhaps at a juncture of our history and our economy where the kind of FDI we were thinking about will probably not come in that kind of volume. Also, the geopolitical sense has also and context has also changed. I mean, there has also been a lot of fracturing of the global system that has an impact. And also, there are other countries where the systems and processes. I mean, not Taiwan. I'm sorry, Vietnam is often given as an example. Is something that we are probably not able to really build scale possibility at the level that, say, or efficiency at the level that Vietnam does. Though I have to say here that some of the southern states are probably getting there.
Yeah.
Tamil Nadu, for instance, I was just looking at the numbers, is really, I mean, its economy is actually comparable to Indonesia or Malaysia. It's really a middle income country in that sense. So some of that is already changing. But I want to know, what is your assessment of the tapering of FDI in India?
No, I think Hindol is an excellent question, and of course, as you hinted at, you earlier worked at Invest India, and of course, you've seen this inside out as well. See, there are 2, 3 factors here. There's gross FDI, there is net FDI, and then we also have to put it in a macro cycle of the dollar index and interest rates. It's a bit geeky topic, but it's important if you really want to understand it. See, gross FDI in India has not fallen that much. Net FDI has come down to 0 for the last 12 months. Part of it is just repatriations. So India has been a profitable market, and has been a liquid market. Some people have criticized Indian DIIs as being suckers. I don't agree with that, but let me just relay that argument so that you understand this. Because the Indian retail investors have been constantly putting in money, the liquidity in the Indian markets is high. And when you're in a bad situation globally, except US, and you want to sell something, you sell what is more liquid, right? So it's a counterintuitive thing. You actually end up selling what is more liquid because you can sell that fast. Like, you have 2 flags.
For 1 second, Harsh, and ask you, you're absolutely, I mean, this is a very, very important point. And this whole thing about, Indian retail investors being suckers is the sort of tonality somebody like Shankar Sharma, for instance, would adopt.
I had him in mind, but I did not want to take the name. But yes, I
Yeah,
had
but
him in mind.
he often adopts this that, oh, look, I mean, these guys don't understand anything. And look, all the clever ones who are abroad and foreigners are all exiting. And, all the Indians are. Please elaborate on that point and tell us what you think.
Okay, sure. Now that we are discussing personalities, why not? So the see, I'll simply say, and I'm generally not so below the belt, but why not once in a while? See, at one point, Shankar Sharma and Rakesh Jhunjhunwala were spoken about in the same breath, you know, and Shankar was always very, very cynical. Rakesh had a very simple point of view that you just be bullish on India. Now, Rakesh Jhunjhunwala is no longer with us. He had some health issues, but in terms of market performance, the verdict is very clear. Who was the sucker and who was not the sucker for believing in the India story is very, very clearly played out in front of us. So, Shankar Sharma's views beyond that, I would not like to personally comment. I'd simply say this, and this relates to the dollar cycle also, which I'll come to in a moment. The Indian investors are betting on India for a couple of reasons. There is one is, first of all countries' investors have in what in financial literature we call home bias. So there is a global market, let us say, approximated, not perfectly, but approximated by MSCI All Country World Index, in which, because of free float and other reasons, India is only 2%, even though Indian market cap globally is around 3.5%, 3.7%. It's around 2.5%. Of course, the Indian investor is like 70, 80% and 80, 90% into Indian equities. And the only reason it's not 10% is less because the ultra elite has assets outside to some extent. Middle class is mostly all in India. So there is an element of a home bias. Secondly, India has been genuinely the only large story in the world over the last 2-3 decades, which has had scale, growth, and ROE. Americans have ROE, Chinese had growth. Americans did not have growth if you do on a 20-year period. Last 10 years, yes, like CAGR. And I'm talking about constant currency terms. The Chinese did not have ROE because they had, what I tell some of our clients I meet is if you have SOE, you don't have ROE. So we call it PSU. The Chinese call it state-owned enterprises. They don't have ROE, and also because their overall system philosophy is they feel equity enriching is a waste of money. So the Chinese capitalism is there, but there is some socialism generally with Chinese characteristics. They feel like basically finance is a wasteful activity. There is a mindset within Xi Jinping's brain trust that you don't need too many. They are now changing that gradually because they want consumption to come in, etc. But long story short, India had scale, growth, and ROE, which no other global market had. We can actually go through the numbers. Even today, India has the second highest ROE amongst the major markets after the US. You can do a 20-year dollar CAGR on the growth, and then scale automatically gives you only 10, 15 markets to invest in, right? So it's generally been a great market to invest in over time. So number one is home bias, which is psychological everywhere. Number two is generally a great market. And number three, admittedly, there is a bit of a capital account convertibility issue as well. I have generally been in favor of an open capital account, but we always have to sequence it. You first always liberalize the inflows, then only you liberalize the outflows. And I was talking with Kushal yesterday, and I was telling him that on this point, because the way the kind of dollar cycle got extended due to COVID, Ukraine, etc., actually, I have been wrong and others have been right that we had to actually wait a few more years. So in that sense, I'm happy to change my opinions as well. So because last few years, beyond a point, the mutual fund limits for outflows were not increased, although individual LRSs remained $250,000 per individual per year. So there was also a regulatory reason why they were kind of captive, although most Indian investors don't feel captive. I mean, they're very, very, it's not financial repression in any sense because they're putting money out of happiness almost, right? Because of the returns that have been there. So it's a complicated topic. That is the reason why I disagree with Shankar Sharma, because the Indian market's track record of delivering over a 10, 20-year weighted average period is pristine. It's not something I'm talking will happen in the future. These are already numbers in hard dollar terms, currency adjusted over time. It is unmatched. I think the only three markets which have done excellent returns is India, US, and Taiwan. Taiwan is the whole chip story, and we know Taiwan's geopolitical situation. And India has over 25 years actually outperformed the US. And I think India is the only market which has outperformed gold over 25 years. So these are numbers which are not being set from an Indian nationalist point of view or a fund manager who's potentially talking his book. These are hard numbers. So I disagree with Shankar Sharma. I mean, whatever he says sounds very cute and interesting, but it does not pass an empirical test. But coming back to FDI, see, Gross FDI has been there, but a lot of money has been going out. So net FDI got close to zero. See, if you actually play the dollar cycle, and this is very important for your viewers, the dollar cycle started in the late 60s, early 70s, especially early 70s, when Richard Nixon got the US off the Bretton Woods standard. So, till the Bretton Woods standard, the Americans had a tenuous link to the gold standard. Gold was officially at $35 per ounce. All other economies' currencies were supposed to be linked to the US, and the US was supposed to be linked to gold. This was the post 1945 arrangement between John Maynard Keynes and the Americans, and they all met in a resort in New Hampshire, which is why it's called the Bretton Woods Standard. Now, what happened was, because of welfare, the Great Society, LBJ in the 1960s, and of course the Vietnam War and the overall expense of the Cold War, defense spending, the Americans just had to gradually close the gold window. Like earlier, what was happening was the West Germans came, look, I'm giving you so much this, you give me so much gold, because that was the understanding. And then they were like, we don't have enough gold to give you from Fort Knox. So gradually, by the early 1970s, these currencies became floating. In 1973, it became fully floating, all the DM currencies. After that, we've had three full dollar cycles. So early 1970 to late 70s was one half down cycle. Till 1985, it was up. So that's one full dollar cycle. 1985, we had something called the Plaza Accord. 85 to 95 was down. 95 to 2002 was up. 2002 is when the last down dollar cycle started, which is when we had the BRICS rally, and Nifty, Sensex, etc. all had 40% CAGR for 5 years. And then from 2011, 12 till I would say the beginning of this year, 13, 14 year, we had a dollar up cycle. So at the peak of the dollar cycle, it's not surprising that Indian net FDI is zero. That I'm not in any way taking away agency from ourselves. Whoever has been a successor in Invest India, the other government departments, we have many more red tape to cut. The Prime Minister just formed a couple of days ago a high-level committee on non-financial regulatory reforms, regulatory cholesterol. Manish Sabharwal is on that. Niti Aayog guys are on that. FICCI, CII, etc. So more power to them. The quicker, the better. But there is also a global macro context. So I would simply caution, let's not beat ourselves too much about it. You can look at the Chinese numbers also, net FDI, because during the peak of the dollar cycle, generally the interest rates are high in the US as they are right now. The dollar has been accelerating for a few years cyclically, and then the investors, they say, well, the dollar is going up, risk-free rate is high, why should I invest anywhere else? And then the cycle turns. So actually, I would actually prognosticate within a margin of error with due probability, and therefore I could be wrong, but by 2030, we will see an avalanche of FDI and FII in India in the next few years, to the extent that our policymakers will talk about things like Tobin taxes, hot money, blah, 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 that, too much hot capital is coming in. What kind of incoming restrictions should we have? So this cycle happened in 2006-7 as well. You go back and see the Economic Times headlines, the various Business Today headlines, same things. People were saying it's too much hot money coming in. How many
I remember,
forex
I mean, I
reserves?
used to be in journalism in those years. I
Yes.
just began out in
So
journalism in CNBC,
it's
and there
just
was a
that the
talk of the
cycles are long.
Indian Gilded Age, so to speak.
Exactly. It's just that the cycles are long, and this dollar up cycle got elongated by COVID and Ukraine, and to some extent by US shale, to be fair. US shale, US big tech. So I'm not taking away from the core productive aspects of the US economy as well, no doubt. And we can go into the details thereof. But roughly a down cycle or an up cycle lasts for 9 to 10 years. This one was slightly elongated. And because for a lot of us, we went from our 20s to 30s to early 40s or whatever, it felt like the new normal. But it's not the cycle. The cycle is not the linear extrapolation. There is a cycle and there is a structural trend. So at the peak of the dollar cycle, to extrapolate Indian FDI net, Indian FII net, Indian GDP growth, Indian multiples is analytically incorrect. I mean, I understand some people may see or perceive it as apologia, but analytically it is incorrect. And whether people agree or not, at least it's my job to put that out as context.
I think this is very well put. And this is very important. I think a lot of people, including within the state apparatus, need to understand these details, because sometimes policy making is so far away from from the world, for instance, where you sit today, that,
Yeah.
some of these things are never, and there's constantly this idea that, oh, well, Vietnam is doing this and so on and so forth. But there are other issues that are playing out. And, as I said, I mean, some of our southern states are now becoming as efficient as compared to any
So
other
very quickly on
global.
Vietnam, since you mentioned Vietnam, very quickly,
Yes.
Hindol. See, Vietnam, Chinese, despite the geopolitical rivalry and
Yeah.
despite them fighting a brief war in 1979, which was inconclusive, but nonetheless, the Vietnamese gave the CCP a bit of a bloody blow. Um, the Chinese are happy to transfer some production to Vietnam, the way the Japanese were quote unquote happy to transfer to China and Southeast Asia in this kind of flying birds theory of East Asia, Southeast Asia, flying geese theory. The reason is there is no way the Chinese see the Vietnam as becoming a strategic competitor or equal
That's right.
to them.
That's
So
right.
that kind of thing transferring to India,
Mhm.
both from an Indian point and Chinese point of view, there is wariness, and despite the recent Trump tariffs and bit of a datant, that will not fully go away. So I think that is one of the main things to consider when we just very glibly compare ourselves with Vietnam. The dynamics with respect to China are very different from both sides,
Yeah.
and therefore let's not just one to one correlate it. That's my only humble request.
Let's talk a little bit about America now, and the entire scenario of these tariffs playing out. I agree with you, Harsh, that this is. I mean, number one, this is only Trump. I mean, we don't know what comes after Trump, and Trump has only a few more years, and after that, constitutionally, he cannot, try and become president once
Yeah,
again. But there are 2 points there, right? One, of course, is even if Trump leaves, there are always remnants of, almost a foul stench, as it were, that
yeah,
clouds
yeah,
relationships between countries. And we've seen this, what happened with us in 1971. We're still talking about, we still mentioned it
yeah.
in newspaper columns and so on and so forth. But the other thing is not just what's happening between the US and India, Harsh, but the global situation in a post-globalization, the phrase that's being used again and again today, a post-globalization world. And I want to understand from you, considering you sit at this intersection of the markets, of business, and of course, so many important investors, how are people who do this every day thinking about this post-globalization world?
I think, see, by and large, people's view is that globalization, if you include both goods and services,
Yes.
and if you are ready to include the nuances of economic nationalism, which have to be put in, I always say, along with Friedrich Hayek, you also have to look at Friedrich List. He was a German American economist in the 19th century, like halfway between Alexander Hamilton and Abraham Lincoln. So, if you are ready to play with the nuances and not a black and white caricature, by and large, investors feel, and I think rightly so, that globalization with all of the modifications is a genie that's out of the bottle. You cannot put it back into the bottle. If Americans genuinely try to curb it too much, they'll basically end up isolating themselves. Because as important as the US is, it's about a fourth of the global economy in market exchange terms and about a sixth or slightly less in purchasing power parity terms. And which these numbers used to be like half or more right after World War, right? So sure, even now it's very important with 4% of the global population, then was 6%, and the economy was much more dominant. It is not powerful enough to completely put the genie back into the bottle, right? And that is the fundamental difference between the current US China or Sino US Cold War and the Soviet US Cold War is the amount of economic interlinkages, right? Which is why ultimately even Donald Trump had to pause. And we can go into deeper conspiracy theories, but the most obvious thing is the economies are just too interlinked to kind of go to 150%, which at one point he tried. Uh, so I think investors are not very worried because there is an element of services, for example, global capability centers, IT services. Why are they all coming to the Bangalore's and Hyderabad's and Pune's and Gurgaon's of India? Because, you know, at $20,000, which translates into like 17, 18 lakh rupees, you can get a very good engineer with an MBA, who speaks English well for the foreign clients, has 4, 5 years of experience, uh, and maybe not from the very top institute, but who can be really productive compared to a median US white collar worker. And if that median white collar worker has to be in SF or NYC, or maybe slightly cheaper in Austin, etc., they cannot. It's not like a matter of preference. They cannot survive at less than $100,000, right? Especially if they have a young family. It's just not possible. The rent, the state, local, federal taxes, etc., etc. So the current rupee, which I disagree with the consensus of some people that the rupee is fundamentally overvalued, is actually undervalued right now. But the point is, it's just not that arbitrage is so huge, the skill set is so large, and the talent pool is so deep, and every year it's being refreshed. Despite all the problems of Indian education system in quality terms, the sheer numbers. I mean, to quote a person we don't like, but Stalin said, "Quantity has its own quality," and that just is such a thing that services trade is not ending. The Chinese are deepening the goods trade. I mean, despite Galwan, our overall goods trade and even deficit has actually increased with the Chinese in the last 5 years. Why is that? Because you want machinery, you want intermediates, you want components for your own manufacturing revolution and industrialization. So I think India obviously has shown that we did not join RCEP, we did the right thing. We may think of CPTPP. We are very much going after a EU trade deal. The European bureaucrats are also finally waking up to that being done. We got it done with UK, we got it done with Australia, we got it done with UAE. We had earlier FTAs with ASEAN and some equivalent version of that with South Korea and Japan. So this is not Atmanirbhar Bharat is not autarky, it's autonomy. So again, I'm saying, like, if you go to Hamilton, if you go to Frederick List, and if you adjust for the fact that shipping containers are cheaper, etc., you have more communications today. America also traded, but all large economies became rich by having some protectionism, quote unquote. But this Indian protectionism version is very different from the Nehru Indira one, because you're allowing almost complete FDI. I mean, with some asterisks for Chinese FDI, but almost complete FDI. You just want value add to happen in India. And you look at the weighted average tariffs, you look at the overall restrictions. This is not a closed economy by any means. Indian services plus goods, imports plus exports, overall trade to GDP is 45%. The equivalent number for China is 35, for the US is 25. Sure, they are larger economies, so there is a base effect. But India is not in any way a closed economy, some kind of land which has no connection to foreign competition. That's not the case. Even today, our largest manufacturers are Suzuki and Hyundai Kia.
Let's go on,
It's
Harsh,
being
from what you
recorded.
were talking about, and which is, of course, this post-globalization moment. And you were saying that, essentially it's a genie out of the bottle and it cannot be, brought back in that sense. Therefore, where do you see this, how do you see this panning out? Because one of the things that, people like me who work in international relations now really worry about is that the US will become, in a sense, more and more defensive as its power wanes. Now, of course, some people in America will tell you, no, with the coming of AI, the US will once again leapfrog to the top. But if you look at where the Chinese are going, and indeed, if you look at where the Indians are going, that sort of leverage that it had after the Second World War does not seem likely. So, how do you think this will pan out?
See, we often think of the Anglo-American relationship or the UK-US relationship as being extremely close, and has been the case always. That's actually historically incorrect. Besides the obvious fact that the US fought for its freedom from the UK in the 1770s and 1780s, till as late as 1815 or the 1810s, they had another war, because remember, UK meant Canada back then as well. And I think at one point in 1815, the White House was burned down. We also forget that in the US Civil War, 1861 to 65, initially the British very sneakily tried to recognize the Confederate States as a separate entity. They didn't quite go that far, but they were pushing towards that. And from there, kind of short to medium term strategic interest, it made complete sense that a united United States should not emerge out, right? Because that's exactly what happened. And after the 1870s and especially 1880s, 90s, remember 1871, Italy and Germany also became nation states. Germany under Bismarck. And by the 1900s, early 1900s, pre-World War One, Germany and the US became industrial colossuses which were becoming comparable, and in some cases much bigger than the UK. And both of them used some kind of industrial and trade policy in today's jargon, right? So they had some tariffs. They focused a lot more on internal trade. The German state actually came out of a union called the Zollverein, which was based on pre-1870 kind of removing internal duties, tariffs, having in one common external tariff. In many ways, today's EU is just 200 years later version of that, right? You know, have internal free trade, external, you have some tariffs, whether it's the name of carbon or anything else. The US went through the same thing. US had 40% weighted average tariffs on imported manufacturers throughout the 19th century on average, 40%. And of course, at that time, shipping was also not as cheap as it is today. So there was anyways a gap between across the Atlantic Ocean. So the US-UK relationship went through a lot of turbulence. There were episodes in Venezuela, there were episodes in Philippines, here, there, etc. It's only later on that it became what now seems to be so friendly. And of course, the US is a senior partner after the two world wars. So I expect you're absolutely right. As the US relative power declines, and power by definition is relative, right? I mean, prosperity can be absolute, but power is relative. It declines, and it'll be more visible as the dollar cycle turns. I'm not talking about de-dollarization or online conspiracy theories of structural weakening of the dollar permanently. I'm talking about a cyclical down move right now. You will see what Trump represents is to to use an Alan Bloom book title from the 1980s, The Closing of the American Mind. Right? It's like the guy who says, I mean, I got out and therefore I'll take the cricket bat and run away. So or as Ha-Joon Chang called it, kicking away the ladder, right? You know, when you're dominant, you talk about free trade, but when you're not dominant, either early or later on, then you start becoming protectionist. And everybody did. The Chinese did it, the Germans did it, the Japanese, Koreans, and very much the Americans also did it. I don't see globalization itself reversing, but the Americans are likely to be in this state of flux. Where I would add is because when we were discussing just a moment ago, you mentioned about Donald Trump and just kind of waiting out his presidency. See, whether the GOP wins or Democrats win, this system of protectionism, the way America is imagining it, is now again embedded in the US body politic. You may hear many more sweet sounding words, but it's not going to be fundamentally reversed. There may be some setbacks by the judiciary here and there, and which will sound very major for that particular time. But overall, this trend is not going to reverse. Remember, almost all of Donald Trump's tariffs, especially on China, were not reversed by Biden. In fact, he put new technology controls. The difference between the Democrats and the Republicans under Donald Trump is a curious mix of what he called paleo-conservatives and neoconservatives. Paleo-conservatives under Robert Taft, etc., used to be relative isolationists. The neoconservatives were kind of world empire guys. The Democrats are almost now neocons. And the question in front of Donald Trump is, does he want a G2 with China? In which case, countries like India don't make much sense for him because you are doing these spheres of influence. That explains his wanting to annex Greenland and Canada and having the Europeans bow in front of him. So that of the Western Hemisphere, he's the king, and let the Chinese and the Russians take care of the Eastern Hemisphere, so to speak. Or what Rush Doshi, as an Indian American analyst, somewhat more aligned with the democratic ecosystem, says, allied scale. Because if you want to remain prosperous as America right now, you have 4% of humanity. India has 17%, for example. Sure, human capital is not equally spread out, but it is converging, however, gradually. The only way America remains dominant is instead of walling itself out, it tried to wall China out. But it did the exact opposite by then also putting all these tariffs on allies and friends. So, however ham-handedly, the Biden administration was at least trying that. They were trying to create a wall of not just trade but tech, and have the friends and allies on this side of the wall and the Chinese on that side of the wall. So Donald Trump thinks, maybe because he was born in the 1940s, that he can actually bully everybody at one go. Now that moment is gone. So that is the fundamental strategic error in the US approach. So that will not last. Now the question is, to what extent the protectionism in the next administration, does it do this allied scale approach of getting allies and friends behind the wall? Or does it do this take it all alone approach of Donald Trump? Irrespective of what they do, India is ready because India has options on both sides. India is the swing state of the 21st century. Again, coming back to the markets, which is why I don't think the markets are particularly worried, because immediately when we had Donald Trump's tariffs, with the Chinese, we had obviously a bit of an understanding. The tunnel boring machines, the TBMs, the fertilizers, many of the industrial parts, they all were approved. And it's not like the Indians went with, kind of bending the knee to the Chinese emperor or anything like that. The Indians just a few days ago had signed a strategic pact with the Philippines. In fact, did exercises in the South China Sea, which the Chinese objected to. So India is very much going on its own terms to both poles. Now, I argue India is a great power. It is a pole. It is arguably the weakest or one of the weakest poles or the three, four poles. India, in a different sense, economically less, more so, militarily less so, Russia are the weaker poles. US and China are the stronger poles. But despite even potentially being the weakest pole, India is a pole. And I think the Indian markets understand that India has options. And whatever exogenous event happens, we are likely to respond to that, I would say, relatively deftly. It may take some time. So we are not particularly worried because one way or the other, some of the other door will open up. And a 1.45 billion market of potentially rich customers as they go from the 20s to 30s or 40s, demographically transform, is just too big a price. Why do you think, for example, Apple, I told you about Apple now lobbying for India on so-called India's behalf with Trump. Why? It's not just that he could not have built more iPhones in Vietnam or for that matter in Eastern Europe or Brazil. It's not just to serve the American export market, but if you want to serve the Indian market, you also have to manufacture in India. That is what that gentle protectionism, if you want to use that term, which Modi started in 2017, 2018, said, listen, because we signed something called ITA, Information Technology Agreement under WTO in 95-96, which applied to consumer electronics, phones, computers, etc. In a way, it did not apply to auto and auto ancillary parts. And almost overnight, we went to zero tariffs. People forget Bharti Airtel, like Mr. Mittal, actually in Chandigarh, etc., in Punjab in the 80s, late 80s, was a push button manufacturer. By the end of the 1990s, India had lower value add in consumer electronics than it had at the beginning of 1990s. So liberalization was such an epic moment that it covered many other sins of Indian policy. And one of them was getting the pendulum too far to the unilateral free trade side, which did not happen in auto ancillary, but it happened in consumer electronics. Now, after 2017-18, we took a step back. Apple recognized that. It said, yes, we can manufacture elsewhere in Vietnam, etc., if you want to diversify out of China or Brazil or Poland or where have you, or parts of Africa. But then how do you enter the Indian market? So the Indian manufacturing is using scale of the Indian market, the latent scale of the Indian market, to then export out of India. And in that sense, and it's a very subtle point, we can agree or disagree, but import substitution, properly understood, goes along with export promotion. What happened, the way we did it wrong the last time with license Raj and a fixed currency, was the rupee got overvalued because the inflation was high. And nominally devaluing the rupee was seen as a hurt to national pride. So in 1966, we did it. It was seen as a big event. And because the rupee got overvalued, imports became cheaper and exports became less attractive. So there were many technical mistakes we did, but the very idea of import substitution per se cannot be junked, nor can it be delinked from export promotion. But yes, any industrial policy has the risk of cronyism, and the final test of any successful industrial policy is the export market. So with these nuances, this is what state capacity is. Unfortunately, I can't give you or anybody else a bumper sticker answer to this. Having fine-tuning these nuances is where state capacity matters and state credibility matters. So in that sense, globalization is very much going to remain, but industrial policy is also back, and the two will coexist. And India is at the forefront of the transformation. Remember, India did this 2017-18 thing even before Trump launched his full trade war against China, because I think Prime Minister Modi realized in his first 3-4 years of power, 2014 to 2017, that this conventional Washington consensus make in India thing is not working. That you have to use the leverage, the potential monopsony of the Indian market as an additional carrot. Of course, then you have to do the ease of doing business, the market competition, the export competition, the things which we did not do back in the 70s and 80s. But along with that foreign competition, you have to somehow soft weaponize the potential allure of your market. Otherwise, if everything is open, people will just default to what is known to them, what is comfortable to them. Alexander Hamilton said the the uh, the habits of character, the habits of manufacturing. If they did not have those tariffs in early independent America, British manufacturers would just have continued manufacturing only in England. But once they had those tariffs, American capitalists around New York, New England had the incentive then. They had a 30-40% wedge, therefore, to build those textile plants, those early manufacturing plants in New England. Berkshire Hathaway, of course, is a textile plant from that era. The name also gives away the New England origins. So that's where it comes from. So it's a nuanced way to play it, but I think India has, because India's scale on its size, if you marry that with good state capacity, and that's not a given, I'll totally concede that, but we seem to be taking the right steps broadly, then India is relatively safe from come what may, the global geopolitical flux may throw at us.
Two questions about this, Harsh, and I'm glad you mentioned this point because it brings me to the other question that I've been discussing. Now, there has been a lot of despair and chest beating about, oh my God, look, these tariffs are now going to destroy us and our rise and this, that, and the other. But you have been saying, and I agree with you that I think one of the things that modern India does not understand enough, of course, of course, bureaucrats will tell you they always understood this, but perhaps it doesn't understand enough, is the kind of leverage India also has. I mean, just the other day,
Yeah,
as always, the Twitter mob was informing me that India has no leverage, which is not correct. I mean, it has never been true. It was never true even when we were much poorer, and it's certainly
yeah,
not true today. And you are someone who agrees because you've been talking about, the importance of the GCCs, for instance. You just
yeah.
alluded to it a few minutes ago, but you keep talking about this on Twitter. I wonder if you can take us through your thoughts on this. That certainly this idea that India has no leverage and the quote unquote FANG companies and their sort of scale of ambition in India gives us no leverage is certainly flawed. I mean, I certainly believe it's flawed. You have a far more detailed take. Take us through it.
Yeah, absolutely. See, the FANG companies or Max 7 or US big tech, they're now almost half of US market cap. So it's around $30 trillion or so. Max 7 just by itself is around $19 trillion. The overall US market cap is 66, $67 trillion. To give you an idea, India is $5 trillion, right? So the US exceptionalism, the last holdout of US exceptionalism is actually the financial markets. And actually, I wrote a piece in Business Today in January saying this is the last holdout and it will also fall in a gentle cyclical sense, not in some world beating kind of tear down this wall sense. And actually the US dollar had the worst first half year since 1973, the dollar index, and 1973 is when currency started floating, so it basically had the worst first half year of all time. The reason this is very important is whenever we say about, see, US big tech was walled off by the Chinese, right? So the Great Wall of China became the Great Digital Wall of China, the Great Firewall of China. Fine, China is anyways a totalitarian system. They had their own censorship needs. They did what they did in their own understanding. We are not saying we have to copy them in toto. But what happened because of that was they developed their own softwares and internet systems, now AI systems. And therefore, there is no way on earth that the Americans can read all their emails, can manipulate all their social media algorithms. I mean, today, let's first understand what is at stake. There is an economic angle to it, there's a national security angle to it, and both of which are underlined in technology and where the India leverages. If, let us say, there is a bipole somewhere in UP or Bihar, we don't even know the guys looking at Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whether in Hindi or in English, and even WhatsApp forwards or what is highlighted or not highlighted. We have zero clues about the algorithms. In fact, I believe as part of the trade negotiations, we wanted access to them. I think that was refused. We tried to kind of back check, but that's not the same thing as knowing the original, right? So we have no clue. And this is a real problem. Ultimately, we all think we are not vulnerable to being manipulated in terms of our emotions, but this happens in a very subliminal manner over time. So, first of all, given that all of us are consuming our information, we're talking to each other, WhatsApping each other, emailing each other, all on American platforms, in and of itself is a huge national security risk.
Absolutely.
American laws, by law, I mean, I'm not talking about the deep state. Deep state can do anything. I mean, same with India and China. But the by law, all foreign digital communication can be accessed by the US Federal Administration without a warrant. This is important. So there's not even like an additional kind of maker checker prevention of abuse. All foreign digital communication can be tapped into legally by the United States without a warrant. They did it post 9/11, FISA laws, etc. Right? Okay, so that's there. In fact, even they tap American communication, but they don't do it directly. They do it through the Five Eyes network. So they may do it sitting in Canada and Australia. And so basically, the White House can look at any digital communication it wants for all practical purposes. Okay, I'm not saying there are one or two exceptions, but basically, more than any other country on earth, it can look at anything. So that's a national security risk in of itself. We saw what happened with Nayara Energy. It may be partially Russian owned, but it was a refinery. It is a refinery on Indian soil. And in lieu of foreign sanctions, European sanctions, Microsoft suspended its data access to its own emails, to its own data for a day before it backed off when Naira went to the courts. And nonetheless, it was a warning shot, a very clear warning shot. So if India is serious about becoming a great power and a superpower in the 21st century, and I always openly say India should be a superpower and will be the world's largest economy. So first of all, I have no idea why we have so much apprehension. I understand, don't count your chickens until they're hatched. But if you constantly underestimate yourself, that also has a self-fulfilling effect. And in an open democratic system, you can't hide and bite the way Deng Xiaoping did. There are limits in an open, competitive democratic system to not openly talk about your ambitions, which others can also listen to. Number one, India should be a superpower, and no serious superpower can totally mortgage its digital sovereignty, which increasingly is complete national sovereignty. That's number one. Number two, on the economic side of it, when we say, okay, what did Canada just put a small digital tax? And Donald Trump said zero trade deal, 50% tariffs, or whatever the exact number was. Next day, Mark Carney, who initially said, I'm not Justin Trudeau, I'll deal with Donald Trump in a much braver manner. All bravado ended. Within a day, he called Donald Trump and said, okay, we are removing the digital tax. And US big tech can have full access without paying any additional revenue to the Canadian market. Remember, this same US big tech deplatformed Donald Trump when he was still the sitting president in January 2021. So, of course, Biden was elected as president-elect, but he was still President Donald Trump. But now, because he's back in power and quote unquote, he is the state, we talk about Indira is India, India is Indira. This is like Trump is America right now. America is Trump. He is back to, supreme power, at least in the midterms next November. He has said that, you don't impinge on US big tech. US big tech is a huge part of the American economy right now, and especially stock markets. And Donald Trump is obsessed because remember, 65% of American families now, a global record, directly and indirectly, most of them directly have investments in the stock market through their 401ks or or even the taxable stock accounts, right? So there is a serious wealth effect if the stock market goes down in the US, which is not being necessarily considered in a one-to-one sense. Whenever we talk about India potentially indigenizing some big tech stuff or having some taxation or some antitrust, Competition Commission of India, or data localization or privacy, because remember, this is talked, data localization was passed as a bill, became an act, it has not been fully implemented yet. And there's massive lobbying by US big tech to push back against it. Like they did with MasterCard and Visa against UPI. Luckily, we prevailed at that point of time. So whenever we speak about this, one point which comes up is, what about our IT service exports? What about our GCC exports? So the idea is that if we even so much as think about thinking of gently taxing or regulating, forget blocking like the Chinese did. I mean, that's like the ultimate nuclear option. There are many intermediate steps, public procurement, at least critical installations, government offices, army offices, some of which has happened, a lot has not happened. The first thing that comes up is, what if the Americans cut off the Indian business and IT exports, service exports? There, my point is where the leverage comes in. Your talent pool of millions of white collar, software knowing in many options, English speaking, at these salaries is just not there anywhere else in the world. The salaries in Krakow and Warsaw have increased as Poland has become more prosperous and integrated into Western Europe, being in Eastern Europe. Philippines or Manila is too small. Mexico is too small. There are linguistic issues. There is the breadth and depth of talent and that scale and that salary issues. So just like Chinese manufacturing is extremely dominant, and despite the best efforts of India and US, weaning off is at best a gradual process, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. Weaning off Indian digital and business service exports is extremely difficult for anybody else. Again, this is something we do not appreciate, and I understand why there's risk aversion. For a lot of people, these jobs have given, understandably, through their hard work, through their family's hard work, their first real shot at a middle class or upper middle class lifestyle. And any politician has to be careful of going gung ho and putting this at risk. Totally understand and appreciate that point. Nonetheless, we need to do a cool-headed, dispassionate analysis. Is this a vulnerability? Is this a strength? I think it's a strength. It's a quasi-monopsony of the kind of labor you have at those rates and those skill sets. And because they cannot go after that, and almost all Fortune 500 companies in America have a back office or a GCC or a subcontracted to IT or some other business in Bangalore, Hyderabad, Noida, we are completely joined at the hips, just like America was joined at the hips with China, is joined at the hips with China for manufacturing. So while China, despite being a geopolitical foe, I'll just quickly finish that, could also nonetheless go after US big tech, especially on software, less on hardware, because they also allowed Apple and Teslas to come in with conditions. We also can take baby steps without being so scared of our wits every single moment that as if the skies will fall, they won't. That is my limited point, that we are not weak. This is a specific case of leverage. Of course, the broader leverage is geopolitical size, potential. But even on this point, since you mentioned GCCs and US big tech, let us not be so scared that hum data localization bhi nahi karenge. Like if Microsoft, for example, suspended Naira's email access for even one day, where is the $1 billion fine on them? I mean, how dare does Microsoft suspend an Indian client's access in lieu of foreign sanctions, which are extraterritorial to India? India is not accepting that. These are not UN sanctions, by the way. On what basis will India accept that? And therefore, where is the penalty? And if you let this go without a penalty, the message that goes is it's all fine. And in many ways, having Indian American CEOs has, our popular press is so enamored and bedazzled by them, by the American dream, and we live vicariously through their success sometimes, that it seems like very cuddly, but it's not. They're just agents of the US state. US big tech and Uncle Sam are joined at the hips.
This is US
so this is something, so I think this is not an easy thing to solve. I'm not going to say this can be done overnight, Hindol, but we need not be as scared as we are. That's my humble point. We have
very good point. Just think about this. I'm so glad you mentioned this. This is exactly the point. The same leverage that China has in goods with the US, India has in services with the US. I think this is one thing that is not understood, certainly not by our popular press. I would even say not even by our business press. Even Indian business press does not have the capability to understand this. And they really should.
Thankful. Yeah, they're thankful this perceived generosity, for this strategic altruism, as this Indian American strategist used the word. I forgot his name. He's a Mumbai boy. I forgot his name right now. Strategic altruism, that we think it's a gift. It's a gift to India. We don't understand if AI could actually automate the so-called agentic AI, these jobs would go away in a jiffy. So it's not a gift. This is our advantage.
That's right.
And see, just one final point on that. Tens of billions of dollars are being spent by Indians advertising to Indians through platforms often run and programmed by Indians. Profits going through third-party digital havens, not even America officially. And hundreds of billions of dollars, potentially $1 trillion of market cap is left on the table. I'm not saying be maximalist, but see, by giving a carte blanche to US big tech for the Indian market, not only have you prevented people say, what happened to coup? Remember, the way digital economy works is it is a natural monopoly. The scale effects, the network effects are so extreme that why would I as an investor put money in an Indian startup, which I know is going against $1 trillion company? Why would I put money in a startup which is going against $1 trillion company at the peak of its game? So this is where the state comes in, whether we like it or not. The moment you create some Indian champions here, people think it will be because all the big business. No, it will be probably some young smart chaps in Bangalore, or maybe Zoho, or people like that. They then not only dominate the Indian market, because the Indian market is still small in relative profit terms. They can then go and export to Africa and ASEAN. The Europeans are stifling under US big tech. So the it's not just what the Indian market represents to the Americans, it is also co-opting a potential competitor if you play it game theoretically. So this is a very, very important point which is missed. I am not
Absolutely.
saying let's go all gaga,
And actually,
but
this has
just wanted
happened
to add.
before in a big corporate sort of way. This is exactly what happened to Indian Telecom when Indian Telecom entered Africa, right? You build a particular scale, you build efficiencies in that scale, and you were able to then take that and rebuild it and,
Bharti,
take it to other parts of the world.
absolutely. So I think, see, the scale economies, and then we have to be careful about the downside of scale, where you just have too much inefficiencies. It often happens with the governments in a centralized sense. But in the private sector, scale economies are completely underestimated by average economic literature as well. See, what the Chinese did was, just to kind of oversimplify the Chinese model, they threw money through financial repression at infrastructure, industrial subsidies. They said just get foreigners, mostly American companies, to invest in these Chinese SEZs on the coast. Don't ask for JVs, but don't directly ask for instant tech transfer. Of course, you do some cheating and stealing, but what happens is the ecosystem that builds around these mega Apple plants or Tesla plants. Beyond a point, more and more value add is done by the ecosystem of ancillaries. At some point, the queen bee is replaced by the Americans. The American queen bee is replaced by the Chinese queen bee. So you built up, you get the American queen bee to basically incubate an ecosystem of ancillaries or suppliers of components. And eventually you basically cannibalize that queen bee and have a Chinese queen bee. This is exactly what happened with Apple, exactly what they did with Tesla. So, it is industrial policy, but it is industrial policy done smartly. My worry is we are so traumatized by 1970s Indira Gandhi license Raj
That's right.
that any discussion of the state brings out this proto-libertarian in all of us,
Yeah.
that the state is absolutely dysfunctional. See, if you've given up on the state,
Yeah.
see, state is a very interesting word. In Hindi we call it sang.
Yeah.
That in Hindi, Sanskrit we call it sang. It shows that it is a sign of our unity. It is a sign of our collective will. So, as a former libertarian, as a recovering former libertarian, I feel like this is a broader political philosophical shift we need.
Yeah.
That as people who today try to push the India story forward, we cannot be completely suspicious of the Indian state. This is not to say that public choice theory is not correct. This is not to say that it will not be co-opted in cases. And we need investigative journalism. We need honest judges. We need honest officers to then go after that, and honest politicians above all. But you cannot write off the state. That's a very broader meta point here.
And also, if you have any ambition, Harsh, in conclusion, if you have any ambition to really geopolitically rise, there is no geopolitical rise without the state. I mean, you cannot just on the
Absolutely.
basis of being a big consumerist market hope to geopolitically rise, because this is about statecraft and strategy as much as it is about the markets.
No, no, I fully agree with you. Remember who invented the internet? DARPA, the
That's
US,
right.
US State Department of Defense. Who invented all space technologies? They're all dual use. Every single
Yeah.
space rocket also overlaps with a potential ICBM. So the idea that the state is just there for insurance, just there for physical security, not for innovation, not for a fiscal military state, not for financialization beyond a point, is not correct. You know, the Cold War led to a proliferation of technologies which then were used in civilian cases. It was the Sputnik moment which scared the Americans, which led to the invention of all of these things. GPS, in fact, even solar power, even electric vehicles beyond a point. So the initial seeding of the R&D happened by some state for some strategic purpose. India up to a certain point free road, and there is a certain strategic charm in free riding. I am not against free riding if it works for you. I don't have a moral righteousness about this thing. But the point is now India is getting to a level, a size, despite per capita levels still being low, but the technological complexity, we are reaching a point where free riding is getting more and more difficult. And you have to do that basic applied R&D, basic and applied R&D. And my only point is, instead of hectoring the private sector, why you're not doing R&D, it is up to the state policy to create the incentives to do that R&D. See, why are the US big tech able to do this? Because they have the global market ex China. Their profits are hundreds of billions of dollars. For them, therefore, to incubate many projects, some of which fail. Like Apple tried desperately to make an EV. Ultimately, that project was written off. But Xiaomi did it much quicker in China because it was part of that industrial ecosystem there. And Apple could not do it in California. So the point remains that if the incentives are there overall, to tell a private sector guy that, listen, there is a gold at the end of the tunnel, who are you trying to say this to? The reason that guy is in that place is because he can sniff gold from a mile away. So there is no reason to hector the private sector to invest in capex or R&D. See, we can mention it. I'm not saying politicians should not mention this at all. They should. But realistically, it comes down to incentives. You give a lecture and somebody will listen to a lecture and move on. But for that to happen, the state has to use statecraft, the way the Chinese did, the way the Americans did it. The Americans, we don't talk about it much. But the Americans, even under Reagan, the height of Reagan-Thatcher libertarianism, had steel tariffs, had what was known as voluntary export restraints, VERs, because they did not like the word tariff, on Japanese and West German cars. They used statecraft for the Plaza Accord, which devalued the dollar in 1985, for example. So the state is not going away. Yeah. We need the state and we need market competition. And let's get over this college debate of socialism and capitalism. The real world does not work like that. I love a bumper sticker, but the real world works in the grays. That's all.
That's an excellent point to wrap up this conversation, Harsh. As always, it has been great fun and great learning talking to you. As always, you're in the space that you work in. I mean, you're not a traditional wealth manager. You're thinking about so many diverse connections between philosophy and economics and the markets and how government works and policy works.
History.
That is always really exciting talking to you.
No, Hindol, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. We were trying to do this for some days and look forward to talking to you again sometime very soon.
Thank you, Harsh. Thanks very much for your time.